Hey everybody, it's Bust with day 3 of the spoiler season of Fates Voyage Beyond. Today we're going to be looking at the third champion, the Runeterra exclusive one, if you will, the Elder Dragon. And so if you want to see more about him, you can go to the main site, the Play Runeterra page. They have this dragon spotlight there, give you a little bit of a taste of his entire kit in video form. And so we'll pull it all up on screen. This is the entirety of his kit. There's a couple of other dragon sort of cards that have already been spoiled, but they don't directly interact with the Elder Dragon. We'll come in and touch on those in tomorrow's video. And so feel free to give them a quick read over. We're going to jump in, talk about the Elder Dragon a little bit more in depth, but some of these cards within his kit are going to be very important in terms of actually making him work and function. And so it might be worth your time to just go ahead and pause the video and give all of these units a quick glance. And here we have the Elder Dragon pulled up on runeterra.ar. Sorry the image is a little small, but this is the best way I can think to flip through it. It's got like 8 or 9 separate abilities all attached to the single card, and so as we want to go through those kind of easily, you have to sacrifice the picture size for ease of use. But nonetheless, the way that we'll try and look at the Elder Dragon here is we'll talk about him objectively, just kind of looking at the stat effectiveness and the cost and the deck building aspects of it, and then we're going to circle back around, talk about building around the dragon itself, trying to generate some big OTKs, and then also just using the origin ability in a kind of non-Elder Dragon based deck. And so, as we dive in and talk about the Elder Dragon, every one of his abilities does come in and mention the boons, right? You can see aspect of the dragon will call it out, his cost reduction thing does it, and then on play he plays all of them. And so, to speak to that before we really dive into the dragon, his aspect of the dragon origin ability says you can put any followers that cost 6 or more into your deck during deck building, and then when you play a unit with a 6+ base cost, you pick one of the 2 dragon boons to play on it. And so in terms of just his functionality and deck building, it's kind of like playing Rise, right? You get to play expensive units instead of playing burst cost spells, and then whenever you play one of those expensive units, they get one of these boons. And so with the boons, I think there's 6 of them for the most part. They just give the unit +1/+1 and a keyword. So there's a 1/1 and a fearsome, a 1/1 and a tough. There's a 1/1 and an impact. And then there's a few different ones along with Deathless, which seems like the most powerful option. Challenger, and then heal 2 to everything. And so the kind of idea off of the origin ability is you can play all of the expensive cards. It doesn't matter what faction they come from. And then as you play one of those expensive units, you get some kind of bonus attached to it. That ties into his other abilities quite well in the sense that he costs 1 less for each dragon boon that you've played, since otherwise you just couldn't play the Elder Dragon, right? And so as you play these 6 cost cards, it's going to reduce his cost and then let you actually cast him. Then once you do cast him, he has this play ability to where you play all of the dragon boons onto him, so he should be getting +3/+3, Deathless, Challenger, Fearsome, Impact, heal a little bit, and tough. And so a wide collection of keywords that come down on him. And then to actually get him to level up, the theme that everyone wants to see, the big wall of text on the back end, he has to see 70, he doesn't have to see, you just have to attack with 75 total power of units across the course of the game. And so that functions like Jax does right now, to where you attack with a couple of units, it sees that 6 attack has happened, that adds to the total, and then on that big turn where you're trying to finish off the game, you can see the Elder Dragon attack that counts for like 13. You have to assume that you have another couple of big units on the board, and it's probably going to amount to say 25 or 30 attack power in terms of actually getting him flipped. Getting the dragon flipped, though, it does have the most interesting text in the game up to this point. I cannot be stopped, in all caps. And so Riot Dirtle over on Twitter has a wonderful thread on what I cannot be stopped actually means. You can feel free to ask him any number of questions that you feel like may stop the Elder Dragon, and the answer is just no. And so essentially, once it comes down, it can't be removed from the board in any way. It can't have any negative effects attached to it. You can't kill it. You can't obliterate it. You can't return it back to hand with recalls. It's just stuck there on board. You can't really do anything about it. In addition to that, it can't be blocked. And so the assumption is that if the Elder Dragon hits the board flipped and you get to attack, then the game just ends. And so that does bring up some very interesting considerations in terms of what you're going to be doing with the Elder Dragon. And so we'll circle back to that in a little bit more in terms of the deck building around the Elder Dragon. But in terms of his, just stat efficiency and everything, I just don't think that matters, right? If he's going to have this level 2 ability to where you just attack and win the game, then it doesn't really matter what his front side is. I can't imagine that there's going to be too many games to where you play the Elder Dragon on, say, like turn 9, and then he doesn't get to just flip on turn 10 and immediately win you the game. And so it's not a space like, say, Mordekaiser, to where it's like, well, his stats are kind of okay for a 7-drop. He has Challenger, that's neat, but he doesn't have Elusive, Overwhelm, or Rally. You just have to kind of assume that the front side of the Elder Dragon just doesn't really matter that much, and that he's just going to be able to attack and win the game. But to help fuel the cards that you need to actually get him flipped, to get the boons rolling, get the cost cheapened, he does have a very useful flip spell in that sense, so maybe it is kind of practical to have him on board on occasion with the Primordial Roar, which says to refill your mana to full. We've just been through that with the Cosmic Call, so I'm very interested to see if there's anything useful there. And then you draw all 6 cost followers from the top 6 cards of your deck. And so if you do actually get him on the board, if you have to pay the full price to get him down, he should be able to search up the top of your deck, find a couple of friends to go along with him, and then have that be the way to get that attack in. But it's always just very strange with me. I always pull up these champions and want to think of them in the sense of like, okay, we have a two cost champion like Samira. She's a 2/2 quick attack. That's fine. She has all of these other stats and abilities tied into it. That's great and interesting. Or you look at a champion like Morgana, right? And you're like, okay, well, she's like a 3/4/5 drop. That kind of sucks. Like Lifesteal makes it kind of okay. She has these other abilities that can kind of make up for her stat ineffectiveness. That's fine. But when you look at a card like Elder Dragon, it just doesn't matter, right? I just have an incredibly hard time imagining that there are very many games whatsoever that the Elder Dragon comes on board, attacks, and just doesn't immediately flip and win you the game. And so maybe I'm wrong with that. I mean, if we are going to be wrong about it, do I want to be playing a like 13/13 with a bunch of keywords on it? And I think that, I guess it is worth warranting a little bit of discussion, because if you want to think of that unit as costing 8 mana, right? Would I play a 13/13 for 8 mana that only has Fearsome? Probably not, right? If it had Overwhelm, probably would. With Fearsome, probably not. And so what if it costs 7, right? That starts to get it in the space of just being like Nasus, and that's kind of a maybe. Nasus comes on board as like an 8/8 for 6 mana. That's not too crazy, right? You're not like thrilled about it, but he is probably threatening the flip to where he gets super powerful. Like getting the Elder Dragon down for 7 mana, kind of interesting. But the thing I kind of have with that is if you're getting him down to 7 mana, that means you've played 5 units that cost 6 or more, or started the game at 6 or more, right? It's going to assume you have some cost reduction along the way. But that just feels like a spot to where you've just won the game anyways. And so in terms of just like stat efficiency and objectiveness, I don't think that the Elder Dragon is very good, but we are going to talk about some very good things. I don't want to leave you hanging like we think the Elder Dragon is a bad card. I think this is going to be fantastically powerful, but just from that kind of objective perspective as to where what happens if I get the dragon down on turn 7 or turn 8 and attack and he doesn't flip, that doesn't sound that great to me. And so let's speak to that first aspect of the Elder Dragon, actually getting that big OTK. And at what point in the game do we need to be pulling that off for it to be effective? And how challenging is it going to be to actually pull off? And so I think the kind of closest point of comparison is going to be with Rise. Right? Rise is similar in the sense that they're both Runeterran champions. They have this unique deck building ability, but the thing with Rise and his attack-based OTK is he's kind of a self-contained unit, right? Rise just shuffles all of the world runes within to your deck, and then you just draw them over the course of the game, cast them as they turn up, and then you typically just win the game on turn 8 or so, right? That's just basically what Rise's thing is. But in comparison to the Elder Dragon, he's going to function a little bit differently, right? You have to actually deck build around in specific ways to make the Elder Dragon work. If you're going to be pushing towards the flip, you can't just say, okay, okay, I have the Elder Dragon in my deck. I'm going to draw a few extra cards along the way and then just cast these rando spells, stun your opponent's units a few times, and then eventually just win. You have to actually put these 6-cost units into your deck, which is a massive deck building constraint, right? If you have 15 6-cost units within your deck, those are quite the hindrance on turn 2, turn 3, turn 4 of the game, as you have all of these plays that you can't actually cast, and then you do have to get them on board and then physically attack with them. And so it's much more challenging to kind of pull this off with the Elder Dragon. To me, it's nice that he's actually out here, promoting combat and promoting units being on the board, as opposed to just kind of playing the non-interactive style that Rise is used to. But how challenging is it going to be to build the deck in such a fashion that you can play these 6-cost units and then get the dragon on board and attack and actually have him be flipped? And so to me, what I'm kind of envisioning and what I'm kind of thinking is it needs to be turn 8, right? You need to be getting the Elder Dragon down onto the board on turn 8, ideally attacking then. If you have the attack token, if you don't, then winning the game on turn 9. That is what the kind of break point feels like in Standard, is to where if you're winning the game on turn 7 consistently, Riot will nerf your deck. If you're winning the game consistently on turn 8, that's what tends to be the kind of tier 1, tier 1.5 decks within the competitive meta. And then if you're not winning the game until turn 9 or turn 10, you're probably just too slow, unless you're some kind of dedicated control deck like Karma that's really pushing to get to turn 9 or turn 10. Most of the decks aren't capable of doing that if you're doing mid-rangey stuff like putting big dragons on the board. And so I think that kind of turn 8 point is going to be that spot to hit. And so as we think about these things, like how do we actually get him to hit around turn 8, right? Playing Sigils from Volibear does not sound very good, right? Playing Sigils helps him be cheaper, but it doesn't help you with the attack level up thing. The same kind of deal applies to ramp spells, right? If we cast Catalyst of the Aeons, it gets us ramped up 1 mana gem, but it doesn't do anything in terms of getting the Elder Dragon to flip. And so I think we are going to have to look at these physical units themselves and decide if we're actually going to be playing 4 separate, very expensive, not Titanic, but 6+ cost units, or what else are we going to be doing along the way? And so to me, the big build around aspect, the absolute most important unit that we're going to see that's going to let the Elder Dragon actually do anything, is his friend down here in the bottom middle, the Cloud Drake, the 6th cost dragon that when summoned, you reduce the cost of all allied units in your hand by 1. I think this is going to be the critical and absolute key component to making these Elder Dragon decks work. So you cast the Cloud Drake, it's going to get a boon because it was an expensive card, so that makes the Elder Dragon cost 11. The Cloud Drake comes onto board, reduces his cost by 1, and it drops him down to 10. Now you're in a much more manageable space to where you can just play any other unit on the next turn, right? You can add Alatis the Gallant or Gentle Gemdragon or Ocean Drake, whatever your preferred expensive bro of choice is. That will cut him down to 9 mana and potentially let you win the game on turn 9. Now, that's not in that space that we were talking about, to where we're trying to get the dragon on board on turn 8. But to me, that's where the start has to be. The start has to be with Cloud Drake. And my concern in that space is that the Cloud Drake only hits the units within your hand. And so when you're summoned, you reduce the cost of allied units in hand by 1. If you don't happen to have the Elder Drake in your hand at that point, then things go south really fast, right? You don't want to have to be stalling out the remainder of the game to get that additional time for the Cloud Drake. And so as far as the current format stands, like, I don't really see this OTK being competitive viable if it's all tied into the Cloud Drake. There just has to be something more to where you're able to get the dragon cheaper. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a viable deck that has Cloud Drakes in it and all of these other expensive units in it, because if you play a Cloud Drake on turn 6 and an Ocean Drake on turn 7 and a Alatis the Gallant on turn 8, you have a very meaty and powerful board. Even without the dragon, you can potentially win the game that way. But I think these like really dedicated Elder Dragon based OTK style of decks are going to be just a touch too slow for the current state of Standard. And so we'll see. I would love to see the Elder Dragon come out here and really pop off and get these OTKs going. I think that this is a kind of functionally viable and interesting OTK deck. I like the OTK deck here in the sense that you have to play units on the board to get the Elder Dragon onto board, and then he has to like actually come out and interact in combat. Having these things all be unit based and combat based is very interesting to me, to where Rise was just kind of like playing a side game. You're playing just a completely different game in general. What Rise is doing is so different than the normal course of a game of Runeterra that I didn't think that that was very productive or interesting. But I do like what's happening with the Elder Dragon in terms of generating his OTKs. And so, if we're not going to talk about the dragon just getting the big OTKs, if that's not really on the table, what if we think about the dragon in terms of actually playing towards the boons? And then maybe like 10% of the time we'll actually generate this big OTK. We'll be playing against Karma Set. They're too slow. We get the dragon down on turn 10 and accidentally win that way, although we were just intending to play the boons. And to me, there's two separate angles to that. And the first one is you're playing a deck that only plays one copy of Elder Dragon, right? You don't have to play the full 3 copies of him like you would with, say, Bard to get all of the chimes into your deck. You can just play 1 copy of the dragon, and then that gives you access to all of the expensive units in the game. And so what we've kind of seen over the course of time, at least as far as the dragons decks are concerned, there's a lot of high quality dragons in Demacia, but they all kind of suck outside of Demacia. But you want to be in Targon so you can get access to the one that gives all of your dragons overwhelm. And so having this access to the Elder Dragon does open up deck building space like that, right? We're playing Targon Elder Dragon. We're using the Elder Dragon to put a bunch of big expensive dragons into our deck. But since we are over in Targon, we can then include aspect of the egg, whatever that thing's called, the burst spell that gives your dragons 1/1 and overwhelm, the one actual physical Targon card you want within a dragon's deck. And so I think that's a fair example. It's not to say that there won't be other ways to do this. This is a way to get Curious Shellfolk into some kind of weird deck, right? This is a way that you can get a big Freylord Overwhelm 6-drop, a big Shurima Overwhelm 7-drop, a big Captain Farron 8-drop within your deck, right? You can spread it out across the different factions depending on what you're going to do. And so I think that's kind of interesting as one take. I don't think in this kind of vein and in this place of thought we're ever going to play 3 Elder Dragons, right? Because it's what was very surprising to me is his like secondary boon ability. When you play a unit with a 6+ base cost, you pick 1 of 2 dragon boons to play on it. I'm actually very surprised this doesn't say when you play a unit with a 6+ base cost, pick one of hashtag number of dragon boons based on the number of Elder Dragons that started the game in your deck, right? And so if you're only playing 1 Elder Dragon, you get stuck with the 1. If you're playing the full 3 copies of Elder Dragon, that you get the option to play towards 3. And so that didn't happen. It is what it is. But in terms of this space of getting the Elder Dragon and delivering these boons, I guess that could be kind of fine, right? The thing to me with the boons is some of them seem really good, some of them seem really bad, and it's not really what you're looking for in terms of combat. And so that sounds like kind of an awkward statement, right? The really good one is going to be Deathless, the really bad one is going to be Heal 2, and none of them say Overwhelm or Elusive. I guess that's the real kind of functional way to look at it. And so in terms of deck building with this, again, like I don't see anything in terms of the boons. I don't see anything in terms of the triple Elder Dragon style of deck. I think that you're going to be like fishing for some very, very specific expensive cards. What those cards are, I haven't quite decided on yet, but that kind of dragon build around we mentioned is what it's going to be kind of happening in that space. And so, moving into the Elder Dragon's kit, first and foremost, we have Primordial Roar. And I will say, I just talked about this card for like 4 minutes, and then I realized you can't even play it. And so this one's a bit of a bummer to me. I'm not certain if I hope that this is actually in the game as a creatable card, right? If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, down here at the very bottom of the card, it should have one of those little gems in it to indicate its rarity, and that shows you whether or not you can put it in a deck. This is not one of those things, right? This card is specific to the Elder Dragon and the Elder Dragon being on board and you drawing a second one. Like I was coming up with so many things that you could do with the Primordial Roar, right? You're going to use the Old Timer. So this is kind of like your your Ice Pillar, or if you can make a way to get this cheaper, and so you can use it as kind of a pseudo ramp spell, and all the different things you could do with this, they don't happen. And so that was a bit of a bummer for me. I thought about keeping that in the video and we cut it out, but the Primordial Roar definitely had some potential for interest, but you can't actually include it in your deck. The thing that I was kind of comparing it to was the 8 mana gain 2 mana gem spell, and how bad that felt when you cast it and didn't actually draw any cards, because it was such an investment to get nothing back out of it. But playing a Primordial Roar and not hitting any units doesn't at least feel terrible, because you get all of your mana back in the same time. And so a bit of a bummer, I guess, that this isn't here. I don't know. This feels like it would be a very toxic card if it did actually exist as a deck building build around, but it kind of sucks to see such a build around card not actually out here in the build around space. But speaking to another build around card, up next we have the Gentle Gemdragon, a 6/5 dragon for 6 mana. Not that exciting there, but when you play a fast spell, slow spell, or skill, you give your other dragon allies +1/+1. Now, what you're supposed to be doing with the Gentle Gemdragon is you're playing your Elder Dragon deck. Whenever you play a unit that costs 6 or more, it gets the boon. The boon stuff are all skills, and so as you play the Gentle Gemdragon, it's going to get the skill attached to it. And then it's going to give +1/+1 to your other dragon allies. Oh man, I'm so glad I stopped and just saw the other dragon allies, because I was brewing so many different ways to make usage of this, right? Because in the Elder Dragon deck, this is garbage, right? You don't need to play a bunch of like 7/7s and 8/8s and then start giving them +1/+1. That's just like a win more ability, right? If we want a big stat monster, we can find a big stat monster. We got the Elder Dragon in our deck. But the way that you would really want the Gentle Gemdragon to work is you have a bunch of just cheap units on the board, and then on like turn 6, you go into turn 6 with 3 spell mana, and then you play the dragon, and then you fast speed off a bunch of like pie tosses or something, right, to give your entire team bonus stats. But having to hit your other dragon allies, now that I've read that, I'm not certain where this falls. The kind of perennial problem that dragons have had up to this point is that there just aren't any cheap dragons, right? There's the 2-cost dragon out of Shadow Isles, and then after that there's like 1/3 in Targon, and then a 1/4 in Shadow Isles, and then Shyvana. It's just like you really need a density of like 2 and 3 cost dragons to make that stuff kind of work, and that just doesn't exist at this moment. And so the Gentle Gemdragon, it is a very powerful card, right? If you are in this space to where you say, wow, what would Poppy want the board to look like, right? That's what the Gentle Gemdragon wants the board to look like, but the cheaper dragons just don't exist. I'm curious, like, how many we would want on board to be willing to play this. Like, it probably has to be like at least 2, right? If we're going to play under that idea of, okay, well, I'm going to just play 3 pie tosses, right? 3 1-cost fast speed spells, and 2 is probably good enough, but as it stands, the Elder Dragon decks don't want this, and the current state of dragons are all too expensive to not make this a win more card. This is just a win more card in every aspect. Moving forward, we do have an interesting one in Ottrani Dragon-Worshiper, a 3/3 for 4 mana that when summoned, you heal your Nexus 2, and then you gain an extra mana gem. To me, this is going to be one of the key build-around cards for all of the Dragons-based decks, but my thing with playing the Elder Dragons decks are, how do you win this game, right? You play Ottrani on turn 4, on turn 5 you play a Cloud Drake, on turn 6 you play a Cloud Drake, on turn 7 you play your big, the Elder Dragon, right? That's probably the fastest way to get him actually on board, but you're not interacting with your opponent in any way, right? You are getting a bunch of stats on board, you're getting a bunch of units down, but you're not able to play any combat tricks in this space because you spent all of your mana. You're not able to play any removal spells in this space because you spent all of your mana. And so I don't think that style of deck is ever going to be particularly good, but that's not to say that Ottrani is not very good, right? I think it probably is a very powerful curve to say, play Ottrani on turn 4, and then play Cloud Drake on turn 5, and then on turn 6, you just play Shyvana for 3 mana, and then you still have access to 3 mana on the turn. You can play a combat trick, you can play a strafing strike or something, and then you get a lot of power there. Now, the other kind of big downside to Ottrani, though, is what if you draw her on turn 7, right? Then this card's just completely dead. And so it is a bit of a high roll card. All of the ramp cards do exist in that kind of space to where if you draw it in the wrong order, it's just dead. If you draw too much of it, it's dead. If you draw all of your expensive units before you draw your ramp cards, you're just going to lose the game. But there's no denying that this is a very powerful ability, especially when attached to a reasonably statted body. And so I think Ottrani is going to see a bit of play. It strikes me as a powerful enough card to where when things are going right, they're going very, very right, and it's very, very powerful, and you're going to win that game when you Cloud Drake on turn 5. But the games to where you don't get to play it until turn 7, I think that's fair and fine if you just get kind of stuck with this thing on occasion. Up next, we got to skip those. We can get to the big boy, the one we've been talking about. To me, this is the most important one in terms of both the Elder Dragon deck and then just Dragon's decks in general. If you follow along with what I put up on runeterra.ar, the deck that I actually proposed for Mordekaiser is a Dragons-based deck with Mordekaiser Shyvana that looks to play the Cloud Drake on 6, and then you play Mordekaiser on turn 7. To hit the Cloud Drake again. And so you have a way to additionally cheapen up the other units in your hand. It's just an interesting way to be able to take advantage of this twice. But to me, this is what's going to be the key build around in terms of playing Elder Dragon decks or just playing Dragon decks in general. Because the thing that the Dragons decks always run into is kind of like what we described with the Gemcrafter, right? You play your Shyvana on turn 5, you play your Screeching Dragon you play your Shyvana on turn 4, you play your Screeching Dragon on turn 5, you play your Cloud Drake on turn 6, and then you don't have any opportunity throughout the course of the game to play spells. And so what you tend to find happening is you either have a turn to where you play like a Strafing Strike, and then you bank 3 mana and don't get to add any units to the board, or you consistently find yourself in this space to where it's turn 6 and the only units you have in your hand are 2 4-drops, and you would do anything in the world that you could do to get both of those 4-drops on the board at the same time, and it's just like a big like glut of expensive stuff in your hand. And so I think the Cloud Drake is interesting from kind of both angles, right? As a activator in terms of the Elder Dragon trying to get the expensive units on board, but then in just the kind of General's Dragons deck, right, to where you play a Cloud Drake, it cheapens up like 4 units in your hand, and then as you do roll into turn 7, you're able to play 2 units in the same turn, or you can play a unit and a spell. It feels like it's just going to make all of your cards flow very nicely, and it's a very good deal there. Or you can just play it with Janna, right? You know, Janna wants to see you play your cards on the cheap. You just come out and you play Janna Cloud Drake. That's a deck. You heard it here first. Moving to the next one, we have Alatis the Gallant, the Gallantino. And so a 7/6 Fury for 7, terrible deal. Your dragon boons target all dragon allies. And I feel like this is in that kind of same space as the Gemcrafter, right? As to where we have a board with like 3 dragons on it. We play the Alatis, we get a fresh boon. We now get to play that 4 separate times. And then on turn 8, we just play another giant dragon, so we get to play all the boons again. You're never losing that game. You've already won that game. You won that game regardless of Alatis doing anything with these boons. You won it regardless of that unit coming down on the next turn. And so I guess if we're playing this like Cloud Drake Elder Dragon style of deck and we're looking to cheapen up the Elder Dragon and our curve is Cloud Drake into Alatis, that does give us -5 to the cost on right? Does that give us -5? Does the Elder Dragon, where did he go? Hang on. He costs 1 less for each different boon that you've played. And so you get the -1 cost from Cloud Drake, you get the -1 cost from the boon there. You play the Alatis the Gallant, and then you get 2 boons off of that. And so that is -4. Like, I don't know. This math is hard, and this doesn't sound very good whatsoever. And so, again, like, I guess he would be kind of like key in terms of getting an Elder Dragon deck up and off the board, but again, like in the same vein as that Gemcrafter, you need to have a bunch of dragons on the board. To get a bunch of dragons on the board, they need to be cheap, and the cheap dragons just don't exist. And so as we were kind of talking about that space of you play the Elder Dragon so you can fit a bunch of expensive stuff within your deck, that limits you to 1 faction after that. And so you can play Demacia, which has Screeching Dragon and Shyvana. You can play Targon, which has the 3-cost Faded, and then an Eternal, it has the 4 costs Fury unit, the 4/4 for 4 Fury. And then outside of that, you can play like Shadow Isles for the 2-cost dragon that strikes stuff and the 4-cost dragon that strikes stuff. And so it's like, I'm just not seeing any way for you to actually build up these boards that are going to be a space to where you get like 3 or 4 boons off of this Atlantis. And so it just seems like garbage to me. We can leave it at that. But moving on to the next one, the one that is not garbage to me is going to be the Dragon Allegiant. So when summoned, you draw a dragon if you behold a dragon. And so very powerful ability, getting to come down and then just immediately draw a specific type of card. It shouldn't be that challenging to have enough dragons in your deck to make this pop off on turn 2. But it's one of these cards to where even if it doesn't hit on turn 2, it can still be okay, right? As my strategies over the course of like the past 6 months of Standard have been play a bunch of 2/3s for 2 mana and play them in decks that are good against P&Z, right? That's the strategy we've taken to the past like 4 and 5 Standard opens, is to where we want decks that are good against Janna, we want decks that are good against Karma Set, and we want decks that are good against Seraphine, and then we load them up with 2/3s so we can come out and have positive and interactive combats with the aggro decks, right? If you're trying to play 1-drop Jinx and then your opponent drops a bunch of 2/3s on you, you have a tough time winning those combats. And so, long story short, you don't have to play the decks that we like to play, but I have found that there is plenty of space within deck building to just play vanilla 2/3s for 2 mana, and the Dragon Allegiant can do that, right? If we're playing against random Jinx deck and we get to play the Allegiant on turn 2, fine. If he draws a card, fine. If he doesn't draw a card, fine. I don't care, you know? And then if we're up against something like Karma Set and we need to hold him off until like turn 4 so that we can behold a dragon to actually get the card draw, that's fine as well. And so this is just like exactly what the Dragons decks need. They need this cheap stuff that can come down early, interact on board. Just the only downside for him is he doesn't have the dragon keyword, right? Outside of that, he is literally everything the Dragons deck needs. And it's one of these cards I'm actually quite excited to build around. And so our last one in terms of the dragons, we have the Ocean Drake. And so has that same kind of ability attached to it when you play a fast spell, slow spell, or skill, heal your Nexus for 1. And this is kind of a weird conflicting set of skills and abilities to me, right? We have this 3/5 6-cost dragon, which is a terrible stat line. It has elusive, which tends to lean towards aggressive based decks, but then it has this heal ability attached to it, which applies to slower base kind of grindy decks. And so I get what you're supposed to be doing with the Ocean Drake, and it makes sense in terms of the Elder Dragon deck as to where you play the Ocean Drake on turn 6, you get the boon, which counts as a skill, that's going to heal your Nexus 1. Next turn, you can play another dragon that's going to activate a boon. You can heal your Nexus another one. You can use this to recover from the slow start that you get out of playing dragons, but it just doesn't feel like enough, right? I know that there's a lot of heal running around through these decks, right? There's the Gem Crafter. There was one heal card we've already touched on. Oh, it was the ramp unit heals, right? And then there's the Titanic heal unit that was just printed. Now there's the Ocean Drake. It's like if you're wanting to play heal, it's been here and available. And the only heal anyone plays up to this point is the Stellacorn, right? The 2-mana 1/4. And so it's just like, I don't see the space for Ocean Drake. Like, I can't envision a Elder Dragons based deck that actually wants to play this thing. I just envision it landing in like Annie decks, right? As you're playing like your Annie control deck, your Annie Tybalak Ravenbloom Conservatory deck that can't heal. Getting access to heal out of something like the Ocean Drake could potentially be a thing there. And so it's kind of a weird one, right? The Elusives decks don't want it because it's too slow. The Dragons decks don't want it because it just doesn't do anything, but you might find some kind of weird space, right? Your Annie Lord Broadmane Ocean Drake style of deck may actually, come out and bring some thunder that way. But nonetheless, I think we hit them all. Let me double check on here real quick. We hit all of these cards on top, all of these cards on the bottom. Everything else will be in the variety video tomorrow. And so that is going to do it for us today. Agree with our assessments, disagree, we'd love to hear it. If we missed something or there's something you'd like to point out to us, I'd love to hear that as well. And that is going to do it for us today. So I hope everyone enjoyed the video. I hope you maybe learned a thing or two along the way and you had a good time watching. This is Bustin. We thank you for being here.